there's a lot for the government to consider when it comes to our relationship with the United States. And today we have reports that Iran has claimed a third vessel in the Persian Gulf. Joining me now to discuss this and much more is former Labor Minister Stephen Conroy and founder of ECG Advisory Solutions and former Coalition Senior Advisor David Gazzard. Stephen, I'm going to start with you because you've had experience in the defence portfolio, in opposition, obviously been in cabinet as well. I was surprised when 60 other nations are in talks to join an international shipping coalition. It's not action against Iran per se, it's to secure international shipping routes, that Australia is still, in Maurice Payne's words, seriously considering the request. It seems to me we've been involved in that region for some time. We've had ships there, we still do. Why on earth wouldn't we be involved?
Well, look, Australia's national interests clearly benefit from the international rules-based system. And what is happening is Iran is flouting that system, and it's flouting it very obviously, very deliberately and very provocatively. It's fabulous that 60 nations want to band together to do something. It's hard to see why Australia doesn't want to at least support it overtly. It might not be the best place where we can do the most importance by committing ships, etc. But certainly we could help in other ways.
It might be I would argue. It might be air support. It might be air support, Stephen. That's another thing they tend to like, the US.
No, that's right. I mean, there are things we could probably do that don't diminish our ability to be proactive in our own region. And my, not criticism, is my concern is that we've done not enough in our region for too long. And we've been very active in the Middle East. So I'm supportive of participating, supporting, possibly with resources that are already on the ground in the Middle East. But I wouldn't want to see ships, etc., pulled out of the Pacific, Indonesian area while we've got so much happening on our own back door.
Yeah, well, David Gazzard, the Prime Minister, I think, has been very front-footed, if I can use that term, about how important he sees his diplomatic relationships in the South Pacific. I think he's visited probably more countries. He hasn't even been there for a year yet, in that first 11 and a half months, than anyone else that's been there in recent times. And it's clear from comments, we've seen them absolutely over the weekend reiterated again, that he sees building up our neighbourhood as his primary focus. Now, hallelujah. Kevin Rudd spent a lot of time and taxpayers' money trying to buy votes for the UN a long time ago in places where we really have no influence, and let our backyard get us all into a bit of trouble. But we can walk and chew gum when most of or the vast bulk of our crude is coming through the Straits of Hormuz. We'd be mad not to be involved in looking after our interests.
I agree with Stephen on that. It's gratifying to see that so many countries are pulling together in order to preserve normalcy on shipping routes. And of course, Iran is already suffering because they've had major restrictions placed on the ability with sanctions on how they can trade. So it would be a fantastic outcome, I think, for anyone in the democratic West, particularly where we need a free flow of goods and services, including oil, going through that region, to be, standing shoulder to shoulder in that. Now, whether or not that takes away resources in this part of the world, I don't know. That would be a decision for the national security of cabinet.
Yeah, and I make the point again, we are one of the only countries in the world, a developed nation like ours, that doesn't meet that 90-day fuel or oil supply test. We're at roughly 23 days, less if you're talking about diesel, less again if you're talking about avgas. So I think it's absolutely critical. Other things I found interesting, Stephen, was it's a long time since I've been privy to a leader making comments publicly that we've all heard them say behind closed doors in relation to concerns about China. What's their long game? We all talk about their economic opportunity, and we've benefited from that here in Australia more than most. But are we all now starting to wake up to some of the risks with the China relationship?
Well, I think it was very refreshing to see Mike Pompeo being so honest, open, and saying some things that I'm sure didn't go down well in China. But Australia has for too long believed and wanted to believe, and there was nothing wrong with this, wanted to believe in the benign rise of China. But China's activity over the last 4 or 5 years should have shaken up Australians, should have shaken up the world to pay attention. This is a sleepwalking that Obama started. You can't put this at Donald Trump's door. This was a period when Obama was in his second term. We'd have the red line in Syria. The US were in disarray on foreign policy. Hasn't been a great focus of the president. Great to see such a high-profile figure in Mike Pompeo here. But absolutely, it is important that you consider the costs and the benefits. I think you made the point about the universities. I mean, universities that have sold their soul for a stream of only Chinese students have been derelict in their responsibilities. They should be having to answer questions about why they have got only one supply system, Chinese students. If they've based their economic modelling, their revenue on that, they deserve to be absolutely dealt with publicly. And so it is absolutely refreshing to have such an honest conversation taking place about the importance of China, but the importance of maintaining our national sovereignty and our national interest.
Yeah, it was interesting, David. He pointedly made the remarks in the speech at Sydney at the State Library yesterday about universities. He's pointed out universities. I know from my time in government, I used to get beaten around the head by business leaders who never wanted us to say anything negative at all about China. The university sector is almost as bad. Do we think the government's going to start putting pressure back on universities, particularly those with these Confucius centres, to be asking for more information about where the funding's coming from and what's being said in language on their campus grounds, and whether that's in Australia's long-term interest?
Well, it's interesting to see that universities that have got at least a stated objective these days to believe in free speech have got these Confucius centres where at least part of the curriculum seems now to want to be signed off in Beijing, while there's been all this disquiet about the Ramsay Centre, for instance, and no universities wanted to take that on. So, I think sort of the chickens are coming home to roost on that. That said, I mean, it does need to be stated that education is now, one of the most important service exports to China. So I think it's still more valuable than all of our agricultural exports. So it has become a very, very dominant sector and an export success story, and that is at least in part because of China.
Yeah, but just on that point, and this is the point I was discussing with Mr. Secretary, are we being bought off? Is our judgment being clouded by the rivers of gold that have been coming out of China for some time? Resource money, education money, our housing sector has benefited from a boom. Have we got ourselves so far down the path where we're commercially intertwined, and we're now really only starting to see that it wasn't just commercial economic expansion that was driving China, but it's now far more, I have to say, sinister, long-term and strategic at their end? And are we only now starting to wake up that all of this is coming at a cost? And how on earth do we extricate ourselves to some degree that we get our sovereignty back?
I don't think we're at the point where we're losing sovereignty. I noted today that Mr. Howard, the former Prime Minister, opened the Diggers and Dealers Conference, and he was talking about how it's one thing to take Chinese people out of poverty and they'll reward you for that. It's another thing to keep the middle class without freedom of choice and democratic principles underpinning their lives away from those democratic principles. So he was saying it would be interesting to see the flow-on effect of Hong Kong into mainland China. And one of the benefits of having Chinese students here, of course, I accept all your other points and you've got to proceed with caution, but you've got Chinese students en masse going back to the mainland, and they've seen the way life can be in Australia. They have different expectations. So there is that's a positive benefit for the rest of the Western world, because you've got an educated class now that has seen the benefits that come with democracy.
Look, and I agree with that, David, and that's been happening for a number of decades, particularly with student populations going in and out of the United States. I think that is a good thing, and that's the great hope with China long term.